Hi, I'm Stephen Price.
Hello, I'm Cara Githens.
This is the Innkeepers, a podcast by Sanctuary Inn. At Sanctuary Inn, we believe we are called to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers.
On this podcast, we will be interviewing guests who have much to teach us about the many facets of missionary care. Let's learn together and be encouraged to press on in the work God has given each one of us to do.
Well, Cara, why don't you introduce our guest to our listening audience?
Yes, so today we have the pleasure of having Ericka Lopez-Harris, who has been serving in cross-cultural ministries since 1992. And in 2010, she joined Oasis Rest International, formerly known as Life Impact Ministries. She has a desire to further the gospel by strengthening global workers. Ericka Lopez-Harris also facilitates grief workshops for ministry leaders, primarily living cross-culturally. She provides coaching and caregiving retreats for countless leaders, and she is honored that many find her easy to talk to, including strangers in the grocery store line. So she is winning the Author's Pick Award for her Lament poem, In My Soul's Winter. It's a book. Hopefully we'll have the link to that in our show notes. She has studied psychology at California State University, Long Beach, and her expansive learning of loss and life transition occurred while living in 12 countries. Most recently, she and her husband and 2 active sons have lived in Costa Rica for 8 years, and currently they are living in Bend, Oregon. She enjoys walking near the Deschutes River in the summer and being fireside with a good biography in the winter. Sounds like my kind of girl.
Sounds like a great choice of activities.
So you can find out more information about her ministry at oasisrest.org. So that's who we get to talk with today.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you for being here, Ericka.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so as we get started, could you just share a little bit with us about your life story and kind of what you're doing today?
Sure. I came to faith as a young adult, and in that early walk with God, He made it clear that, we were invited to participate in His Great Commission. So what that did for me is it included getting involved in missions, short-term, mid-term, long-term, with organizations, with churches, on board, missions boards or creating policy. And for the last 13 years, my husband and our 2 children, we've been serving with Oasis Rest International, which is previously known as Life Impact.
Great. Well, thanks so much for sharing. And we are excited to just talk with you about this topic of lament. It's clearly a topic that I don't think we address very much, especially in evangelical circles. And so,
Agreed.
So can you share with us a little bit how you began to unpack and learn about lament?
Yes. So as mentioned, I lived cross-culturally in many different countries, but even as a young adult, it's very quick to learn that life is unfair and it has hard elements in it. And so in many of those situations, I personally experienced the need for a deep connection with God and His heartfelt care for me. And so as I was reading through the scriptures, especially in the Psalms, many experienced difficulties and cried out to God about the injustices around them or the injustices to them. And as I was reading, a lot of the Bible heroes were not immune to those sufferings and difficulties, and their response is they cried out to God. Mm-hmm. So what stood out to me is just that in our pain and in our suffering, we can either move towards God or move away from God. So this is our response, to move towards God. He wants us to come to Him.
Yeah.
So that's how my path crossed with the topic of lament before I really even knew that it was called lament.
Mm-hmm. Well, you touched on it a little bit, but would you just describe a little more fully about what you understand biblical lament to be? And you could define lament in general and just kind of specifically biblical lament.
Sure. Well, Cara, you mentioned that lament isn't really something that we use in our U.S. culture. And, the dictionary definition is that it's a crying out in grief. But I love how Keith Thomas defines it as biblical lament, that it's a prayer to God about a distress, that it's a vital prayer for people of God because it enables them to petition God to help them deliver in their distress, their suffering, and their pain. And as a prayer, lament is actually it's not a God denying language, but it's actually it's a God affirming language that reveals a much radical faith and our dependence on Him.
So it's a way to pray that you're running to God, as you're saying, in your pain, rather than pushing God away, and being really raw and honest about that pain. I think often the struggle is that if I'm honest that the pain is really that somehow I'm giving it power or something like that.
Right. Or the fact that absolutely, or if we doubt, or if we, question God, or we say we're struggling, maybe we don't have enough faith, when really we're just coming to the God who hears all of our prayers.
So what would you say are some of the biblical passages? You touched on the Psalms, but can you kind of expand on that? What are some passages that help us understand what lament is?
Yes. So there are many different Psalms. Nearly half of the Psalms are prayers of lament in essence. But there's many characters too that use lament. Hagar when she was running away, David when he was hiding, Jeremiah because he saw the injustice around him, Job with all the things happening to him, Hannah in her infertility, even Mary and Martha when they were lamenting that their brother had died. All of those just reveal that there is sorrow, and this life is not an easy one. Jesus himself in his humanity both cried out in the Garden of Gethsemane and on the cross.
Yeah, those are all excellent examples of people who were honest with their pain and their struggle.
Yeah, it's fun to look at the list of characters that you mentioned and just think about the different experiences in their lives. And, Hagar was put in a really hard situation and then told to flee she was told to leave the family. And, where was she? What was she supposed to do? And she was fearing for her life and the life of her son. And of course, Jeremiah and these others. I mean, these are just really fun to look at those characters. When we lament, I mean, sometimes we think, oh, I can't bother God, or this seems trivial or something, but lamenting actually is something that we need to do. So what does it do for us when we enter into lament?
Yeah, definitely. There's several benefits of lament, as we consider all those characters. They were in a form of grief. Something was happening to them because of someone else, or even because of their own life choices. And so they were, in essence, wanting to process a loss, right? But processing loss isn't linear. It's very complicated. And so lament is, in essence, a vehicle for us to grieve that loss. Lament is also a place for God to approach us. Steve, I think you mentioned that sometimes we try to minimize the pain. And I've heard many a Christian leader think that if they minimize their pain, that God will be glorified more. But that's simply not true. In Psalm 34:18, it says that God draws close to those who are brokenhearted, which assumes that we will have broken hearts. And therefore, God, with compassion, initiates. He's the one who's drawing closer. So it's an opportunity for God to connect with us.
And when we don't enter into that lament, really, we're kind of shutting the door on what God wants to do. And God wants to bring healing and wholeness into our lives. And in a way, we've kind of closed that door to the healing that he may want to do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's an interesting, I was reading this book called No More Faking Fine by Esther Fleece. And she says denying a lament is really denying him, the Lord Almighty, an opportunity to love us well and to see us in brokenness and to bind up our wounds. And when we dismiss and move on without lament, we could be removing the ground. We could removing God from the very sacred ground He wants to meet us in. I think that's so powerful, right? We're very quick to move away things that feel uncomfortable. Yet God invites us, right, to share our innermost groans and feelings. I mean, as I think about so many verses in the Psalms, like, God, why are you avoiding me? How long will this take? Like, save me, for the floodwaters are up to my neck. Things like that just, if anyone is ever tempted to believe that we have to be all buttoned up and in our best behavior, these verses just set that notion aside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, additionally to the Christian community around us, I mean, if we learn to practice lament, not only does God have that opportunity to minister to us, but then fellow believers have an opportunity to speak into our lives.
Yeah. Absolutely. And even the verse in Corinthians, the idea that God comforts us so that we could comfort others, right? And nowhere in that verse does it say that we will not experience those things, right? Yeah. We will experience them so that we will receive the comfort. Yeah. Yeah. And so much neuroscience nowadays tells us how healthy it is for us to express our feelings. And when we do that, when we give words to our feelings, we can be more mindfully aware and less reactive. And I think that when we're more aware of God, it allows us to sense His comfort.
So it changes our attitude towards God when we lament. It changes our relationships when we lament. That's what I'm hearing you say.
Yes.
It can change our character in many ways.
Yes.
Makes us more tender, perhaps.
Absolutely. I think it softens us. We don't have to, press on Christian soldier. You know what I mean? Like God is here to comfort us. And, I have 2 teenage boys. Teenagers and boys are not necessarily the most verbal about their emotions or whatever, but when they come to me and they can talk to me honestly about a situation, I can wrap my arms around them, and give them comfort, even if I can't change their situation. And sometimes I think we can do, we can come to our Abba Father and we can cry out to Him. He is full of mercy and compassion, and He promises to be with us, even if our situation doesn't change.
Yeah. So what happens to us if we don't lament? What are some of the, consequences in some sense if we ignore this part of our life?
Yeah, I think the bigger question is what happens when we don't make space for grieving loss. Again, lament is really just a vehicle for that. And it's big. When we don't make space for grieving loss, the result can be very challenging. Bitterness, resentment, wrongful beliefs about God. It hinders our ability to receive God's comfort. Maybe we're angry with God, or we push away God, and we develop unhealthy habits or ways to cope with pain. I have these teenage boys, so I was reading this book called Raising Emotionally Healthy Boys by David Thomas. And he really is talking to parents about how to raise boys, but I think I just want to quote him, it's super intense of what he says. He says, compared to females, a larger percentage of men or males don't know how to name and navigate their experience. And I think it's why adult men in this world lead to some of the scariest statistics out there. Males lead to the statistics of infidelity, internet pornography, substance abuse, and suicide. And if you think about just those 4, the common denominator is that it's a male's attempt to numb out and avoid whatever he's feeling. So in essence, the male's actions underline this idea that if I can't name it and I can't navigate it, I'll just find some way to shut it out. That's huge. When we think about how if we don't express our grief, if we don't find ways to work through that, there are huge consequences.
Absolutely. And I think of how many men in leadership are the ones suffering from those things you described. And I mean, and if we could get to some of the root of this by offering skills that and helping them to learn this area of naming emotions and grieving and lamenting. I mean, we could kind of, in some sense, you're suggesting we could break some of those chains.
That's the prayer, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think sometimes too, well, I'm just speaking about the North American culture, is that there's not a lot of space for lamenting. And someone can truly want to be in that process or be in that place, and they can go to someone and share a feeling, but then perhaps get a very negative response from that person, like, oh, well, you don't have to, you should be over that. You shouldn't feel that, a lot of the you shouldn't sort of thing.
Yes. I think that's the beauty of reading these laments in the Bible, because we see these biblical characters that, David is considered a man after God's heart, and yet he lamented left and right. There's so many, I mean, he even dared to say, please kill my enemy, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, he was not buttoned up and trying to hide from God. And I think that if we don't call a spade in our grief, there are consequences.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, say someone wants to figure out how to practice lament and grieve losses in their lives. What are some steps? What are some practical ways to do that?
Yeah, as mentioned, lament is a prayer. So just like any prayer, there's no quote unquote right way to do it. But a simple pattern that I could give is what I call the ABC model of lament. And if we look at Psalm 13, it's a short psalm that we can work this ABC pattern. So the A stands for addressing God. And here he just simply addressed God by saying, Lord. The B is the second part, which is be honest. And as we've read some of these already, David was honest with his feelings, and he was honest with God about the questions he had. How long will you hide your face from me? How long will I wrestle with my thoughts and have sorrow in my heart every day? How long will my enemy triumph over me? So, I mean, I appreciate reading these words in the Bible, because David was vulnerable and didn't worry about that God would relate to him differently, right? And so I, as a reader and a fellow believer, can come to God with my feelings of fear and angst, and if a situation is all consuming, or even think that someone will continue doing evil to me, or what I perceive evil to be. David shared all that. And then the last one is C, is call on God's character. So David shifts from his perspective of being in the middle of a situation to focus on who God is. And in verse 5 and 6, he said, but I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord, for he has been good to me. Mm-hmm. And again, God in that moment didn't change the situation, but being able to shift and recall who God is very important in all of our grief.
Yeah. Well, we all encounter situations of grief in our lives, whether it's the death of a family member or illness, sickness, whatever. Yeah. But in the missionary world, there's a lot of loss. And you were talking about just not making the space for grieving loss. And there are so many changes in the life of a missionary. So can you just talk a little bit about lament and the life of the missionary, and just how significant that is as they encounter these losses?
Absolutely. The cross-cultural worker has a unique life filled with transition, and at every transition, there's a loss.
Yeah.
Even as simple as moving to another country, as excited as they may be, it's filled with losses. They lose their regular place of fellowship, familiar faces, a supportive environment. They perhaps leave their family of origin behind. If they have to learn another language, they lose their ability to communicate and be understood. And, as the years pass, maybe they have lost ministry dreams, or they lose friendships. Sometimes churches split or teams dissolve, and friendships and ministry, that's a loss for sure. And then just throw in regular life, right?
Right.
Perhaps it's infertility or earthquakes or seeing poverty around them, robberies, death of a family or death of people around them, or physical health declines. Gosh, the list goes on, right?
Yeah.
There's just so much. And so when you think about it that way, it's almost like it's an invitation for cross-cultural workers to lament, because there's so much there.
Yeah.
And as those things accumulate, the stress and the heart position towards God changes.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you talk just a little bit about when the cross-cultural worker doesn't take the time to lament, and how grief after grief after grief, or loss after loss after loss, kind of piles up, and then what it does to them?
Well, just as I shared with that example, when we don't, with the men, when we don't address it, it doesn't go away. So we're either finding ways to cope with it that may or may not be healthy. But sometimes when you're numbing out feelings, men especially, they just hone in on anger. I'm not saying that women can't, but it just is a very popular emotion of choice, right?
Yeah.
And Christian leaders aren't immune to that. And so what's underneath that? There is loss, there is sadness and pain. And I think Christian workers especially need to have a space where they can share, like a sanctuary inn or an Oasis Rest International, a space
Yeah.
where someone trained can listen to them, give them an opportunity to share their losses, the feelings associated with it. Really, it's not complicated. Just being able to speak it out and have someone listen and validate it and affirm it, that does so much for the soul.
Yeah.
It's in many ways, it seems like many people working on the field need permission.
Yeah.
They need to give themselves permission. Maybe their leadership needs to give them permission. Somewhere along the line, they have to recognize this is important enough, and then step out and begin to lament to God and also to those around them, with, appropriately sharing their stories of loss.
Mm-hmm.
And then healing can come.
Right.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
in your work with Oasis, when you're sitting with a missionary, single couple, whatever, sitting down with some missionaries, what kinds of
Mhm.
things do you start hearing in the conversation that might say, hey, wait, we maybe need to back up and do some lamenting work, so to speak?
Yes. Well, we actively do debriefing retreats with our guests, because whether they recognize it or not, even if they've been away for 2 years, in that whole 2-year period, once you start listing all those losses, their eyes are open to, like, wow,
Yeah.
no wonder my stomach is churning and my neck hurts all day long, or things like that. Just no wonder I can't sleep at night. It's because all of the stress is accumulating. And so by having them go through some, what I call reflective activities, acknowledging the losses, bringing it to God, and then bringing it to God first, and then sharing it with us, a human being who can hear and validate and reflect back to them. There's a lot of healing in that space.
Yeah. Okay.
So how would you say that lament changes us? You're touching on that, but can you expand a little more of what do you think in the life of a missionary will change for them once they start this process?
Yes. Well, I think lament changes us just as any prayer has the power to change us. So lamenting isn't special or in that way, but what it is, it's more vulnerable because we're in a distress. I think we just are more desperate for God.
Yeah.
By being desperate for God, our awareness is heightened for Him and open to His intervention and care. So in the part where that third part, the call on God's character, that is where the lament part gives us hope. And so sometimes these circumstances or the multitude accumulating losses put us in despair. And so the lament can shift us back, our perspective back to God, give us hope, similar to Psalm 27:13, that says, I would have despaired if I had not believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living.
Mhm.
Wait for and confidently expect the Lord. Be courageous and, be strong and take heart. So I just feel like that is the shifting point. It's not necessarily the prayer has anything magical to it, right? But it's the fact that we're talking to a living, breathing God who intervenes and cares for us that gives us that hope.
Yeah, I think I believe it's C.S. Lewis who said, prayer doesn't change God, it changes us. And how that process of us coming before the Lord and being honest. A lot of what you're saying, being honest with God about what's really going on and not hiding it anymore.
Right. Who are we trying to kid, right? I mean, does God not know this already? He created us. He knows our thoughts and our emotions. He knows our circumstance and our situation. So by being more vulnerable with God, an intimacy is created, right? Just like in a marriage relationship, the more vulnerable you are, the more intimate it becomes. And so I think that's what it can do is, allow us to feel God's tenderness, that God isn't this far away God. He's there. He draws near to the brokenhearted.
Yeah. And I feel like so often when we are in those hard places and feeling those losses and the grief, that's when we often feel most distant from God. So this in some ways is a tool, a resource and a way forward when you feel distant, that you can draw near to God. And not just somehow expect. I mean, God does want us to come. He does want to draw near to us, but I feel like he invites us to also come to him.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Just that idea that, as a parent with a child, sometimes when the child is having troubles, don't we want them to share with us what they're going through, the struggles that they're having? I think that's the same with God. He wants us to draw near to him, and he's there with open arms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going back to the list of the names that you rattled off earlier, some of the biblical characters, and I'm just thinking it would be because there's no. I think sometimes one of the best things we can do is just find scripture and pray it back to God and use that scripture. And you just look at the story of Hagar and you think about the topic of injustice or desertion or abandonment. I mean, all of those things are part of her life, and if someone's feeling that way, it could be very beneficial. And the life of David, again, just wanting to see the righteousness of God and prevail in the wickedness of the world just was troubling. Jeremiah, just so much injustice and persecution. Think of someone ministering in a country where they see little or no fruit, and their words just seem to fall on deaf ears, and that was the life of Jeremiah. And I think someone working cross-culturally could really benefit from that. Job, of course, just the whole idea of suffering and not understanding suffering, but yet knowing that God is walking with you. And then you talked about Hannah and a couple of the struggling with fertility and just wanting to see God, wanting to see the blessing of God in their life, but not seeing it and not knowing that blessing of having children. And anyway, it's just a fun list. It would just be a really interesting way to go through and address some of these different and specific issues in our life.
Yeah, it's so relatable, isn't it? All those things are things that either we see or happen in our own personal life, and there isn't. I haven't found anything that isn't untouched in the Bible through a character, or even Jesus himself. He was betrayed. He felt the loss of a friend. He, people turned their back on him. He experienced injustice. Even he was not immune to that.
And he didn't shy away from the pain and the loss and the suffering that all that brought. And he cried out to God and all that. And he's our ultimate model of, Jesus can cry out to God and say, this isn't fair, this isn't right, that we can do that too. And we can
Right.
also remember who God is ultimately. I love how you're saying, just like modeled after the Psalms that we see in the Bible, there is always this like addressing God, naming it how it really is, but then God, you are,
Mhm.
who he is. And I love that turning. It's a both and. I'm always talking with a guest
Yeah.
here at Sanctuary, and often when we feel like we have to, if we say something is bad, then it's all bad. Or if we say something is good, it's got to all be good. And
Mhm.
it's both and at the same time, and hold that tension, and being okay with that tension. I think is a lot of what the lament is doing.
Yeah, we see that in Paul's life too, doesn't he?
Yeah.
Say, even though he's suffering, or while he's in want, he also has what he needs. Or he definitely shows the paradox in his life. And true, we want things to be easy.
Mhm.
We want a
Yeah.
nice life, don't we?
Yeah.
But the reality is it's not like that.
Right.
Not until we get to heaven will it all be great. This life is not, we're not there yet. And yet we can have that hope. We can have that reframing, um, to adjust our focus to the perspective of God.
Yeah.
To say, and yet, or but God,
But God,
right?
yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, Paul wrestled with whether it was better to stay on this earth or to, be present with the Lord. So he was
Mhm.
just struggling. And anyway, it makes the Bible and the people we read about in the Bible just very personal and
Yeah.
very much like us, and I
Mhm.
think that's what we're supposed to read.
Yeah. So, as we wrap up, is there any last words of encouragement that you would like to share with the audience today?
I just want to reiterate that it's a beautiful thing that our God isn't a stone idol. He is not a God who is unaware of life on earth. Jesus relates to the human injustices around him, to him, our despair, our betrayal, pain, and suffering. And God invites us to share all those questions, the doubts, the thoughts, the feelings, crying out in despair. He invites us. He's a God of mercy, a God of comfort, a God of compassion. And, the idea in Psalm 28, 6-7, that says, "Praise be to the Lord, for he has heard our cry for mercy. The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusts in him and he helps me." Just the beauty of that we cry for him and he hears us. It's a praise, actually,
Yeah.
right? Praise to him who heard us, who heard our cry for mercy, because he is a merciful God and he helps us. So I just feel like there's so much hope there, even when our situations are more than despairing, or, we're in a situation that is discouraging, that by shifting through lament, not just ignoring, the pain of
Right.
it,
Yeah.
but bringing that pain to God. God hears us, and praise be to the Lord.
Hmm. Well, thank you. And are there any other books or resources that you want to refer our listeners to?
I do think that the book that I referenced by Esther Fleece, "No More Faking Fine," she comes at it from a little slightly different angle, but I love her honesty. She talks about a situation in her life that she can't get rid of, and she comes back to God over and over again. I just feel like that is very relatable, in a sense that sometimes we find ourselves in a situation that is complicated, can't be solved, or lingers longer than we care for it to.
Yeah.
But God is always present. So I would recommend that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for your time today with us. And I know that our audience will be encouraged by this, and maybe have some more of the language and the tools to step forward and hopefully begin using lament in their life. So thank you.
I hope so too. Thanks for having me.
So, Steve, what was your takeaway from our conversation today?
Well, I really enjoyed the conversation, and she's right. She's very easy to talk to, and it was a great conversation. But when she started mentioning the biblical characters, Hagar, David, Jeremiah, Job, Hannah, and so on, that just really caught my attention. And I thought, you need to go back and look at each of those kind of from a lament perspective. And who knows? Maybe there's some blog posts in there or something.
Yeah, I think it puts on a different set of glasses for you to look at those characters and see them as real people.
Right.
Yeah.
And for you?
For me, I just really appreciated when she was sharing about how the not having the skills of naming and understanding emotions is so clearly impacting men and their coping skills. Like they are turning to really awful ways of handling their emotions. And I just think that, this clearly it's not the only way to begin to deal with these emotions, but lament is a great tool, and it's a biblical tool. And I think that, obviously men aren't the only ones needing help with naming their emotions, but if we could all learn better how to handle our grief and our losses and name them and run to God with them, how it can change us. Yeah.
And she mentioned at one point that when we don't turn to God, we're really denying God the opportunity to love us well. And God is there, and he wants to walk with us through these things.
Yeah, and that image brings me, like, when my kids push me away and they're upset and they're angry and they just don't want me to help them, like that makes me sad. Yeah. And I love it when they want and run to me, and I think that's what God's inviting us to, for that childlike trust and running to him with our pain and suffering.
Well, we hope you enjoyed this conversation on biblical lament.
Thanks for joining us. And if you like this, please like and subscribe and share and do all the things. Let us know in the comments if you have any thoughts about this, and we would love to hear from you. And you can always reach us via email. My email is Cara@sanctuaryinn.org. And Steve?
And I'm just Steve@sanctuaryinn.org.
So we hope to hear from you. Take care.
Thank you for joining us for the Innkeepers podcast. Our mission at Sanctuary Inn is to equip, refresh, and restore God's global workers. We hope today's podcast was an encouragement to you, or maybe the podcast you heard today, you've been prompted to pass this along to someone you know that could benefit from today's conversation. Creating a podcast is a team effort. Cara and I prepare and do the interviews, and we're grateful for the time that our guests give us out of their busy lives to help us learn more about missionary care.
We want to thank Tim Downing for the music he wrote and performed for the Innkeepers podcast. Tim is a very talented musician, and you can find out more about Tim at downingkeys.com. Our podcast is edited by Javier Bolanos, and our website and show notes are prepared by Micah Githens, my amazing husband. You can visit the Sanctuary Inn website to see more of Micah's great work at sanctuaryinn.org.
Thank you for joining us on our journey to learn more about missionary care.